Alright guys, welcome back to another episode of Strategic Angling. My name is Brady Hanna. This is JJ Patton. We are still in Patton Studios over here in Eldridge. This is again presented by K&K True Value at North Iowa. This episode we want to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, especially in years past. It's the football jig, or the round ball head jig, I guess. Most people are calling it a football jig nowadays. I just want to talk about when we use a football jig, what we look for in the football jigs that we choose to throw, when they're most useful, go from there. So, JJ, you want to give us a history, if there is one, of the football jig? I'm sure it's been around for quite some time.
I think the big thing with the football jig is it's traditionally used in or around rock. If you look at a football jig, it's shaped like a football with the line tie kind of in the middle. So as it comes through rocks, it kind of rocks back and forth. It doesn't roll over as much. It doesn't wedge in as much because the head is a little bit wider, so you can bring it through crevices of rocks better and through things like that. It also usually we tend to use a little bit heavier, and so you're dragging it on the bottom and then it kind of rocks back and forth on the bottom as you're reeling it over gravel or rocks. And it's traditionally been used that way offshore, deeper water, heavier jig, and around rock. It does not come through brush as well. It does not come through grass or vegetation as well as a pointed head jig or even an archy jig. But it's kind of a specialty jig around rocks, and it works very well. It's a good smallmouth bass, spotted bass, and deeper largemouth out on ledges or deep rock piles, that type of thing.
Yeah, so I think most people around here probably are using the lighter football jigs. River especially, you don't have to use such a big one, get it down there. Rocks aren't quite so big on the river, they're a little bit smaller. But out at Lost Grove, the 3/4 ounce, the 1 ounce are great. Have been a great way. I can't say this year they've been incredible, but they're a good way to cover a lot of water. Get down on the bottom, feel the bottom. I mean,
yes.
If I'm at a new lake, I like using a football jig just to feel what's going on the bottom. I know forward-facing technology helps with that now too, but it's a good way to just feel bottom, feel transitions, cover a lot of water, and big fish love football jigs for whatever reason. What else we got to say about football jigs?
As you're using them, you're going to find different angles on the line tie or the hook.
Yep.
I think usually it's either 60 or 90 for the most part. A 60 degrees a little bit angled towards you. It's 60 degrees from straight forward, so it's up. 90 degrees is straight up. I think if you're casting a long way, making long casts across a big gravel flat, you want a 60-degree line tie. I think if you're in and among heavy rocks or boulders, I think the 90 sometimes is better because you have a direct point to the eye of the hook where when you pull, it pulls it up out of the rock and then comes over, whereas the 60-degree kind of pulls it along through it. I also like to look for a good keeper. Typically, for me, I like to have a pretty action tail on my football jigs. Something like a chigger craw or a swimming craw from Big Bite. Something that flops around a lot because it's down there swimming on the bottom, and if you ever watch a crawdad on the bottom, their tail's flipping and their arms are flipping. But I like to have a good keeper on my jig. Dobbins has a football jig with a really nice keeper. It has prongs going this way and this way, as well as this way and this way. 4 prongs that really hold that plastic on there. Sometimes some companies will use a screw lock. Sometimes you have to super glue, but I don't like to super glue much because I think a lot of times you're dragging on the bottom, a perch or a bluegill will grab one of your claws and pull it off, and then you got a bunch of super glue up here at the top, and you kind of get a mess after 2 or 3 changes. So the Dobbins football jig I really like. There's a lot of brands that have pretty good ones, but this is probably my preference with a 90-degree line tie.
So football jig, is maybe a little more on the finesse side of things with jigs. I know obviously some places you can get big jigs, big braid, but I think a lot of times you're using lighter wire hook. A lot of times you'll see the skirts flared out for your more finesse jig options. Just want to talk a little bit about these being a more of a finesse presentation. You're dragging bottom. One of the conditions in your mind that one of these football jigs excels in?
I think summertime, when the fish are deeper. I think it's also good in cleaner water because you're fishing deeper water. But cleaner water with current and rock, it's real good. If you're on a clean water fishery like Mille Lacs or somewhere like that, I think the football jig is a good way to drag those deep rock piles, as opposed to in the river. Most of the fish don't live deep enough to need a 1 ounce or a 3/4 ounce jig, and so I think but I think more summertime. I mean, it doesn't have a lot of use around the spawn. Also, I guess wintertime or cold water periods, it would be, a jig is always good in cold water periods because you can slow it down and move it slow. Crawdads typically are not active when the water's below 50 degrees. So if you're mimicking a crawdad, sometimes it may appear unnatural to a fish. If you're doing it in 42-degree water, it may not be appropriate. It still works though. I've caught them in cold water on a jig, but
so that's a good backstory on when. Now maybe tell me a little bit about the how. How are you fishing? How are you fishing this? What are you trying to imitate? I know you mentioned crawdad, but what is the action? I know there's a couple different ways. Snapping a jig is probably popular with football jig, but I think most of the time people are just really using this Carolina rig almost.
Right.
Just dragging bottom. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, drag and stop is definitely a good technique. Stroking the jig where you're really ripping it off the bottom and it comes up. I mean, one thing that you should watch if you ever want to watch it, or if you're ever swimming around in the lake, is go down and watch crawdads and go scare them. And they'll hop off the bottom and then kind of float back down. So that's a reasonable presentation. You'll hop it up and then kind of let it fall down on a semi-slack line. But I think in general, for me, it's more that dragging. It's more of that pull it 3 or 4 feet, maybe shake it a little bit and let it the claws a little bit, and then pull it a little bit more. Maybe lift it a little off the ground, but not off the bottom, but not super high off the bottom. Most of the time for me, if I'm throwing a football jig, it's touching the bottom most of the way back to the boat.
Sure. So JJ, you've given me a little bit about the when, the why on the football jig. Tell me a little bit about the equipment that you're going to. If you said, hey, I want to just dedicate a setup to football jigs, what are you using?
So I'd probably have somewhere between 12 and 17 pound fluorocarbon line. I'd probably have it on a 5-power Dobbins rod, like a DX 745 or a Champ XP 735. If you are more budget conscious, the Sierra 735 or the Cadence 745 would also be perfectly good for dragging a football jig. The reason I want a little bit heavier is typically I have a long cast. I'm in deep water, so there's a lot of room for error, and I want to get a little bit more power in my rod to get the hook through. Now, a lot of these have fairly small gauge wire hooks compared to a flipping hook, so you don't need a super stout rod, and you could get by with a 4-power like a 764, even maybe a 763 on a lighter one with a smaller gauge. But I think fluorocarbon line for sure. I think reel wise, you're going to want probably a 7 to 1 gear ratio. You don't need super fast. You don't, just kind of whatever your go-to, either 6.4 or 7 to 1. I think would probably be what I would be throwing on it.
And for choosing the line strength, diameter, the football jig is not one really where you're as action conscious.
Right.
But a lot of times these fish will feed this football jig on the fall. Lighter line falls faster.
Right.
So if you want a nice slow fall, you could go maybe a little heavier line, but by doing so, you maybe give up a little bit of that sensitivity. I don't know. So how do you determine what line strength or diameter you're using for the conditions?
I like to use the heaviest line I can for just about everything. If you're somewhere super gin clear and they seem to be line shy, you go down to 12. But again, like you said, a lot of it's rate of fall, a lot of it's how fast you're moving the bait, and
Yep.
it feels more natural to me to have a football jig on 15 or less. I feel like when I'm using 20-pound line, it just feels too stiff or too like there's not as much play in the rod or the line as I'm reeling it in. I would usually go around 15, probably drop down to 12. Some guys will go to 10, but I don't feel real comfortable with 10. And nor do I have to. Around eastern Iowa, you don't have a lot of real super clean water, though Lost Grove is, but there's plenty of obstructions out there that you wouldn't want to use 10-pound line around.
Yeah, that for me was the challenge with football jigs at Lost Grove, was just how many I would lose. There's so much cover out there, and the rocks are man-made, so they have huge gaps in them. That's kind of what kicked off the Grove series, which is a now debunked or over with project of mine. But I wanted a jig with a big heavy hook, the heaviest weed guard I could find, and that's not your traditional football jig experience, but that way I lost less. I would actually fish it with braid so I could feel a little more, but that's not your typical football jig experience, and you really can't find many football jigs like that in stores. So I know you recommended Dobbins. What is another one you would recommend to people to try out if Dobbins is not as readily available in stores?
I think the Dirty Jigs makes a good football jig, and they have two different ones if I recall. One of them has a lighter hook, one of them a little bit heavier.
Yep.
Bravarni makes a good football jig. His is a real light wire and a pretty light weed guard, but I prefer one that, like we talked about earlier, that has the finesse cut where the top is kind of cut down, and even if I have one that's double skirted, I will cut it down myself. So I look for one like that. The Strike King structure jig is kind of a modified football jig, and that's a good one too. I think what it comes down to when you're picking a football jig is pick one that you like, pick one that has a color that you like, a line tie that you like. I recommend the 60 degree for most of what I do. I like to have that angle. Make sure it has a good keeper, a decent weed guard, and a good hook that you like, and then just go with it. And probably, a couple and a half ounce, couple and 3/4 ounce will get you most of what you're going to do. I don't think you need to go a whole lot lighter for most applications. And you can go heavier if you're fishing 40 feet deep or something. You might want more like a 1 ounce one.
So before we sign off, I want to hit on color. We haven't mentioned that a ton. This is a bottom bait. You're imitating typically crawfish. I think your darker colors are maybe more successful. You're more natural. Your greens, your blacks,
Yeah.
your browns. Some people certainly can get away with the lighter colors, but I think traditionally people are going with darker things because you're imitating bottom forage rather than bait fish or things up higher in the water column. So
Yeah.
JJ, you got anything else to add on football jigs before we sign this one off?
No, I think that's just grab some and try them. The other thing, like you mentioned earlier, they're real good if you're exploring a new lake, because you can tie a heavy one on and throw it out, and it'll stay on the bottom, and you can drag it, and you can feel differences. You can feel rock, you can feel mud, you can feel grass, you can feel a shell bed if you're out on the river trying to find shell beds. A real heavy football jig is a good way to find that rougher patch, because with a good sensitive rod and some fluorocarbon line, you'll really feel it. And I think that's people overlook that as a way, because now we have forward-facing sonar and side image, and we can drive by and see rock, but not everybody has that.
Yep.
If you're a shore fisherman, you can cast this thing out and find maybe sweet spots where there's a little bit of rock or a little bit of gravel or a shell bed or something that might be kind of a place where you want to concentrate your effort.
And if a shore fisherman asked me what's the number one bait you'd recommend I throw the rest of my shore time to find the biggest bass, I think my recommendation might be a football jig.
Yeah.
They are that effective.
Yep.
So, anyway, this has been another episode of Strategic Angling. We will see you guys next Tuesday. I hope you learned a little bit about football jigs. We really like them. Go out and give them a try, and we'll catch you next week.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.